What happens when Hollywood's most beloved action hero meets late-night television's most unpredictable host? You won't believe what unfolds when Arnold Schwarzenegger sits down with Jimmy Kimmel for what was supposed to be a routine promotional interview, only to witness one of the most explosive confrontations in late-night history. The tension in Studio 6B was so thick you could cut it with a knife, and what started as casual banter quickly spiraled into a heated exchange that left audiences stunned and social media buzzing. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds when these two titans clash in front of a live studio audience. Last night's episode of Jimmy Kimmel Live started like any other. The familiar theme music played, the audience cheered, and Jimmy bounded onto the stage with his characteristic smirk, seemingly unaware that he was about to participate in one of the most controversial moments of his career. Arnold Schwarzenegger, the former governor of California and legendary action star, was scheduled to appear as the night's main guest to promote his latest environmental initiative and upcoming documentary about climate change activism. The interview began innocuously enough. Jimmy welcomed Arnold with his usual theatrical enthusiasm, cracking jokes about the former bodybuilder's accent and making light references to his Terminator films. Arnold, ever the professional, played along with good humor, his booming laugh filling the studio as he settled into the guest chair. The audience was eating it up, clearly delighted to see the Austrian oak in person. "So, Arnold, you're here tonight to talk about your new environmental documentary," Jimmy said, leaning back in his chair with what appeared to be genuine interest. "Tell us about this passion project of yours." Arnold's demeanor shifted noticeably as he began discussing his climate change documentary, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "Jimmy, this is something very close to my heart. We are facing an environmental crisis, and I believe we need to take immediate action. This documentary shows the real impact of climate change and what we can do to fight it." Jimmy nodded along, but there was something in his expression that suggested he wasn't entirely engaged. Right. So this is like your Al Gore moment, right? Trying to scare people into buying electric cars? The first crack in Arnold's composure was subtle but noticeable. His jaw tightened slightly, and he leaned forward in his chair. "It's not about scaring people, Jimmy. It's about educating them. The science is clear, and the consequences of inaction are severe." "Oh, the science," Jimmy said with a slight chuckle, making air quotes with his fingers. "You know, Arnold, some people might say it's interesting that a guy who made his fortune in action movies with massive explosions and car chases is now preaching about saving the environment." The studio audience grew quieter, sensing a shift in the conversation's tone. Arnold's famous smile began to fade as he processed Jimmy's words. "I think there's a difference between entertainment and real life, Jimmy. And in real life, we need to take responsibility for our planet." Jimmy wasn't backing down. If anything, he seemed to be warming up to the confrontation. "But come on, Arnold. Didn't you fly here on a private jet? And don't you have, like, what, 6 or 7 cars? Including some pretty gas-guzzling classics?" Arnold's hands gripped the armrests of his chair more tightly. "Jimmy, I offset my carbon footprint, and I've been investing in clean energy for years. This isn't about perfection. It's about progress and making changes where we can." Right, Jimmy said, his tone becoming increasingly condescending. "So you offset your carbon footprint. Kind of like buying indulgences from the climate change church, right? Pay your money, and all your environmental sins are forgiven." The comparison to medieval church corruption clearly struck a nerve. Arnold's voice rose slightly as he responded. "That's not what carbon offsetting is, Jimmy, and I think you know that. This is a serious issue, not a punchline for your monologue." Jimmy laughed, but it wasn't his usual warm chuckle. There was an edge to it that made several audience members shift uncomfortably in their seats. "Hey, I'm just asking the questions that people at home are thinking. You can't blame me for that." "Actually, I can," Arnold shot back, his Austrian's accent becoming more pronounced as his frustration grew. Because you're not asking genuine questions. You're trying to make a joke out of something that affects every person on this planet. The tension in the studio was becoming palpable. Camera operators zoomed in to capture the increasingly strained expressions on both men's faces. Jimmy's producers could be seen in the background making subtle hand gestures, but whether they were encouraging him to continue or to dial it back was unclear. Jimmy leaned forward, matching Arnold's posture. You know what I think is funny, Arnold? You spent 8 years as governor of California, and the state's environmental problems didn't exactly disappear. Maybe the real world is a little more complicated than your documentary makes it seem. Arnold's face flushed red, and for a moment, the 70-something former bodybuilder looked like he might leap out of his chair. You want to talk about my record as governor? Let's talk about the California Global Warming Solutions Act. Let's talk about the renewable energy standards I helped implement. But I don't think you want to have that conversation, do you, Jimmy? Oh, I do, Jimmy replied, his voice dripping with false sincerity. I'd love to talk about how California's environmental regulations drove businesses out of the state and cost thousands of jobs. Real people, Arnold, not Hollywood celebrities, who can afford to virtue signal about the environment. The accusation of virtue signaling was clearly the final straw for Arnold. He stood up abruptly, towering over Jimmy, who remained seated. Virtue signaling? Is that what you call it when someone actually tries to make a difference, instead of sitting behind a desk making jokes about problems they don't understand? The audience was now completely silent, the usual laughter and applause replaced by an uncomfortable tension that seemed to fill every corner of the studio. Jimmy, perhaps realizing he had pushed too far but unwilling to back down, stood up as well, though he still had to look up at the imposing figure of Arnold Schwarzenegger. I understand plenty, Arnold, Jimmy said, his voice steady but with an unmistakable hostility. I understand that celebrities love to lecture ordinary people about how they should live while they continue to live in their mansions and fly around in their private jets. Arnold took a step closer to Jimmy, and for a moment it seemed like the situation might turn physical. The security staff near the stage tensed visibly, ready to intervene if necessary. You know what, Jimmy? I came here tonight to talk about something important. Something that could help people understand the challenges we're facing. But instead, you want to turn it into some cheap comedy bit. As the confrontation reached this crucial juncture, with both men standing face to face and the studio audience holding their collective breath, it became clear that what had started as a routine celebrity interview was about to spiral completely out of control, setting the stage for an even more explosive exchange that would leave viewers speechless and forever change the dynamic of late-night television. The studio lights seemed to burn hotter as the two men glared at each other, neither willing to back down from what had become a battle of wills broadcast live to millions of viewers. Jimmy's usual comedic timing had abandoned him entirely, replaced by something darker and more personal. Arnold's chest rose and fell with barely contained fury, his legendary self-control hanging by a thread. You want to know what I think? Jimmy continued, his voice now carrying a venom that shocked even his own production team. I think you're just another washed-up politician trying to stay relevant by jumping on whatever cause is trendy. Climate change, environmental activism. It's all just brand management for Arnold Schwarzenegger. The accusation hit Arnold like a physical blow. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, and the veins in his neck became visible as his blood pressure spiked. Washed-up politician? Brand management? His voice was low and dangerous, each word carefully enunciated through gritted teeth. Jimmy, I have dedicated the last 15 years of my life to public service and environmental causes. I didn't have to do any of that. I could have stayed in my mansion and counted my money from Terminator movies. Jimmy smirked, sensing he had found Arnold's weakness. Oh, so you're a martyr now? Poor Arnold, sacrificing himself for the good of humanity. How noble of you to give up your comfortable retirement to lecture the rest of us about our carbon footprints." The mocking tone was too much for Arnold to bear. He stepped even closer to Jimmy, now close enough that their faces were mere inches apart. The cameras captured every detail of the confrontation. Arnold's blazing eyes, Jimmy's defiant sneer, the sweat beginning to form on both men's foreheads under the hot studio lights. "You know what your problem is, Jimmy?" Arnold's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried throughout the dead-silent studio. "You hide behind your jokes because you're too much of a coward to take a stand on anything that matters. You mock people who actually try to make a difference because it makes you feel better about your own meaningless existence." The personal attack clearly stung Jimmy, who had built his entire career on being the likable everyman who could poke fun at celebrities without crossing the line into genuine cruelty. But tonight, that line had not just been crossed, it had been obliterated. "Meaningless existence?" Jimmy's voice cracked slightly. "I entertain millions of people every night. I bring joy and laughter into their lives. What do you bring? Boring. Documentaries and self-righteous lectures?" Arnold's laugh was cold and humorless. "Entertainment? Is that what you call this? You invite people onto your show just so you can humiliate them for your audience's amusement. You're nothing but a glorified bully with a television contract." The audience was now completely stunned into silence. This had gone far beyond awkward television. They were witnessing what felt like a genuine breakdown of professional courtesy and human decency. Several people in the front row looked genuinely uncomfortable, some covering their faces or looking away from the stage entirely. Jimmy's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. The accusation of being a bully struck at the heart of his professional identity. "A bully? I'm a bully? You're the one standing over me trying to intimidate me because I asked you some tough questions about your hypocrisy." "Hypocrisy?" Arnold's voice rose to a roar that could be heard in the back of the studio. "You want to talk about hypocrisy? You sit here every night making jokes about politicians and celebrities. But when someone calls you out on your behavior, suddenly you're the victim. You're pathetic, Jimmy. Absolutely pathetic." The insult hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Jimmy's jaw worked silently for several seconds, his face cycling through various shades of red and purple. When he finally found his voice, it was shaking with rage. "Get out of my studio. Now!" Arnold threw his head back and laughed, a sound that was somehow more threatening than his earlier anger. "Your studio? This isn't your studio, Jimmy. This is a television studio owned by a network that pays you to be their dancing monkey. And, right now, you're not even a very good dancing monkey." The comparison to a performing animal was the final insult Jimmy could tolerate. He pointed toward the exit with a trembling finger. "Security! I want him out of here right now!" But Arnold wasn't finished. He turned to address the audience directly, his voice carrying the authority and charisma that had made him a movie star and elected official. "Ladies and gentlemen, you came here tonight expecting entertainment, and instead you got to see the real Jimmy Kimmel. Not the funny guy from television, but the small bitter man who needs to tear down others to feel important about himself." The audience sat in stunned silence, unsure whether to applaud, boo, or simply remain quiet. Many were pulling out their phones, recording what they sensed was television history in the making. The few scattered murmurs that could be heard were expressions of shock and disbelief. Jimmy's composure finally cracked completely. "You self-righteous bastard! You think you're better than everyone else because you used to be governor? You're nothing but a steroid-pumped actor who got lucky." In politics, the reference to steroids was a low blow that touched on one of the most controversial aspects of Arnold's bodybuilding career. Arnold's face went completely white, then flushed deep red. For a moment it seemed like he might actually strike. Jimmy and the security staff moved closer to the stage, ready to intervene. "That's it," Arnold said, his voice now deadly calm in a way that was somehow more frightening than his earlier shouting. "I've heard enough from you, you pathetic little man. As Arnold began to turn away from Jimmy, the host made one final desperate attempt to regain control of the situation and his show, setting up what would become the most explosive and dramatic conclusion to any late-night television interview in recent memory. "You know what, Arnold?" Jimmy called out, his voice cracking with desperation and fury. "At least I never had to sleep with my housekeeper and destroy my family to feel like a man." The reference to Arnold's most painful personal scandal brought the entire studio to a complete standstill. The affair that had ended his marriage to Maria Shriver and torn apart his family was the one topic that even his harshest critics usually avoided out of basic human decency. The collective gasp from the audience was audible even through the television cameras. Arnold froze mid-step, his massive frame going rigid as if he'd been struck by lightning. When he slowly turned around, his face had transformed into something that would have been at home in his most terrifying movie roles. The jovial Austrian accent was completely gone, replaced by a voice that was pure ice and controlled rage. "What did you just say to me?" Each word was measured and deliberate, carrying the weight of decades of public humiliation and private pain. Jimmy immediately realized he had crossed a line that should never have been crossed, but his pride and the adrenaline of the confrontation pushed him past the point of rational thought. "You heard me. At least when I mess up, I don't leave a trail of broken families behind me." The studio audience was now openly horrified. Several people in the front rows stood up and began walking toward the exits, unable to watch what was unfolding. This was no longer entertainment. It was a public execution of human dignity on both sides. Arnold walked back toward Jimmy with slow, measured steps, each footfall echoing in the silent studio like a death knell. When he reached the host, he towered over him with the full, intimidating presence that had made him an action movie legend. "Jimmy, you just made the biggest mistake of your pathetic career." His voice was so quiet that the studio microphones had to strain to pick it up, but every word carried the weight of absolute conviction. "You want to go there? You want to attack my family? Let me tell you something about families, you miserable excuse for a human being." Arnold's eyes never left Jimmy's face as he continued, his voice growing stronger and more commanding with each sentence. "My mistakes with my family are mine to live with, and I've spent every day since trying to make amends for them. But what's your excuse for sitting behind this desk every night, tearing down people better than you just to get a cheap laugh from strangers?" Jimmy tried to interject, but Arnold's voice rose to cut him off completely. "You think you know pain? You think you know what it's like to have your worst moments broadcast for the world to see? Let me tell you something. At least I took responsibility for my actions. I didn't hide behind a team of writers and pretend my cruelty was just entertainment." The former governor stepped even closer, forcing Jimmy to crane his neck to maintain eye contact. "You want to know the difference between us, Jimmy? When I screwed up, I hurt the people I loved most. When you screw up, you do it on purpose, in front of millions of people because you think other people's pain is funny." Jimmy's face had gone completely white. The reality of what he had done was beginning to sink in, but it was far too late to take any of it back. "Arnold, I didn't mean—" "You didn't mean what?" Arnold's voice was now loud enough to fill the entire studio without amplification. "You didn't mean to destroy whatever shred of dignity this show had left? You didn't mean to show everyone watching exactly what kind of person you really are?" Arnold turned to address the studio audience directly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded attention from movie sets to political rallies. "Ladies and gentlemen, you came here tonight to be entertained, and instead you've been forced to witness something ugly and shameful. That's not your fault. That's the fault of a man who forgot that there's a difference between comedy and cruelty." Several audience members began to applaud, slowly at first, then building to a sustained ovation. It wasn't applause for entertainment. It was applause for human dignity in the face of deliberate humiliation. Jimmy stood frozen, watching his audience applaud the man who was systematically dismantling everything he had built over years of hosting. "Stop," he said weakly. "Just stop." But Arnold wasn't finished. He turned back to Jimmy with a look of complete disgust. "You know what the saddest part of this whole thing is, Jimmy? You actually had talent once. You could have been remembered as someone who brought joy to people's lives. Instead, you'll be remembered as the guy who thought someone else's personal tragedy was material for his comedy routine." Arnold began walking toward the side of the stage where his security detail and production team were waiting. As he moved, he spoke loudly enough for everyone in the studio to hear. "I've been in politics, Jimmy. I've dealt with some truly terrible people, but even they had limits. Even they understood that some things are off limits if you want to call yourself a human being." Jimmy made one last desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of his show. "Arnold, wait! We can edit this. We can start over. Nobody has to see this." Arnold stopped and looked back with something that might have been pity. "Edit this? You think this is about your show? This isn't about your show anymore, Jimmy. This is about who you choose to be when you think nobody's watching. And tonight, everybody was watching." The former governor paused at the edge of the stage and delivered his final statement with the gravity of a closing argument in a courtroom. "You know, Jimmy, I've made a lot of mistakes in my life. I've hurt people I love, and I've failed in ways that were broadcast around the world. But I never, ever used someone else's pain as a punchline for my own benefit. That's the difference between making mistakes and being cruel by choice." Arnold Schwarzenegger walked off the Jimmy Kimmel Live stage with his head held high, leaving behind a studio full of stunned audience members, horrified production staff, and a host whose career had just been irreparably damaged by his own words and actions. Jimmy stood alone on his stage, facing an audience that was no longer applauding, no longer laughing, and no longer looking at him with the affection and respect he had spent years cultivating. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of his own labored breathing and the quiet murmur of audience members discussing what they had just witnessed. As the cameras continued to roll, capturing every moment of Jimmy's complete professional collapse, it became clear that this was more than just a celebrity interview gone wrong. This was the moment when a television host's true character was revealed under pressure, and America had seen exactly who Jimmy Kimmel really was when the jokes stopped being funny and the stakes became real. The confrontation that had started with environmental policy had ended with the complete destruction of a late-night television show's credibility, proving that sometimes the most dramatic endings happen not with explosions or special effects, but with simple truth spoken in front of the people who needed to hear it most.